All right, well, thank you. So it is 1 o'clock. It's 1:01. Let's get started. All right. Let me put the right slide on. So real quick introduction. You're not here to hear me talk about myself. You're here to learn about using Power BI with enterprise data and what your options are. And that's what this session is going to be about. Quickly, my name is Paul Turley. I'm a data platform MVP. I've been part of the Microsoft MVP program for about 8 years now. I'm an independent consultant. I run a consultancy called Intelligent Business. In my second year doing that, I've been working with reporting and BI technologies, mainly around the Microsoft product stack for about 20 years now, just kind of depending on what we called BI or reporting way back in the day. But as I just mentioned, I've been working with reporting services since before it was an official product, and I've been working with the technologies and tools that we now call Power BI since their inception as well. So I love Power BI. I love what they've done with it. I love what they're doing. I love the technologies behind Power BI. I'm a big advocate. I think that there are always going to be interesting challenges, both in terms of how we solve problems with these tools and technologies, as well as for the product teams to continue to make products that work together. That's never going to be perfect and seamless, but I think it's pretty awesome today, and I really love the direction. My head just exploded this morning during the keynote with navigation and parameters, and oh gosh, that stuff is so great. I was the guy in the front row who yelled "thank you" to Amir Nets when they demonstrated that, because we've been asking for that for a very, very long time. So I'm from Vancouver, Washington. That's the other Vancouver down by Portland. We were first, by the way, but we won't go into that. All right, so what's Power BI? Where did it come from? I use this slide very quickly because I think it's important to understand how Power BI fits into the holistic ecosystem of BI tools, rather than just thinking about it as a desktop tool. Way back in 1998, Microsoft acquired a code base from a company called Panoramic that turned into OLAP services and SQL Server 7.0 that evolved into SQL Server Analysis Services, which Microsoft then retooled, they rewrote, and we've had analysis services ever since. Analysis services is a fantastic technology, but it's not something that users create. It's IT-driven, it has a developer cadence to it, and it's awesome technology that's been around for a long time. Back in 2008, 2010-ish, they saw the writing on the wall that this was kind of a dated technology, and in the era of in-memory analytics, they created an in-memory version. Originally called Project Gemini and Vertipack and Vertiscan. The marketing people got a hold of that, and they called it the X-Velocity in-memory analytic engine, and that was originally released as an add-in for Excel called Power Pivot. And there was a SharePoint version of Power Pivot, also released in circa 2010 and integrated into SharePoint 2013. That's also when we kind of, try not to say drink the Kool-Aid, but when we really believed that everything in the world should be in SharePoint, because SharePoint was the center of the universe. And SharePoint's an awesome tool, but it's not necessarily the place to put every single asset that you might think of, all your data, all your reports, et cetera. Power View was a great effort from the reporting services product team, developed in this enduring technology called Silverlight. But it moved forward, and it became part of the visualization experience that we have in Power BI today. And as we've seen this morning, that it just keeps getting more and more awesome and easier to use. Power Query was introduced also as an Excel add-in to really kind of complete the whole story. So now we have a data acquisition, data transformation experience that officially is called Get Data, but we still call it Power Query. That is the M mashup language behind it. We've got the Power Pivot technology that we're calling data modeling in Power BI, which was really based on the same technology as Analysis Services Tabular. And then we have a whole visualization, interaction, and insights experience that evolved out of the work with Power View. That was originally integrated into Office 365. That was great, but it was a little messy. And when James Phillips kind of took the helm of the product team, we saw that come together as just this beautiful, easy to download and install product called Power BI Desktop, and now the Power BI Service. And so there's a great lineage here. There's a great story to tell about all these technologies. But how can they work together, and how can we think about Power BI as an enterprise class tool rather than a desktop self-service tool? Self-service, I think, means different things to different people. I'm working on a large project right now for a company called KinderCare, one of the largest early year educators in this country. And their concept of self-service is we have governed data that IT manages, and we've got master data management around that, and we make sure that there's one version of the truth. And then self-service means you can connect to that, and then you can visualize, create your own reports, as opposed to extracting data and making copies and emailing them around. Depending on your role, you're going to think about using Power BI a little differently. If you are a self-service a la desktop analyst, you're only going to need to use the desktop and the service. And you're just going to use the desktop features, the menus. If you're a data scientist, planner, forecaster, you're probably going to go a little deeper. You'll still use the same tools, but you'll probably care about Power Query a little bit more. You'll probably care about using languages like R. And I'm moving through this pretty quickly. This comes from a training class that I've developed, and I've kind of cherry-picked some of the slides. But for a large-scale solution, an architect of a solution like that may choose to use SQL Server analysis services to do the modeling. And in 2017, we're going to have Power Query baked into that Visual Studio environment, which is going to be absolutely awesome. But Visual Studio will primarily be the development tool, and SQL Server Data Tools, the add-on to Visual Studio, would be the tool that you would install. Again, you are going to think about using some other languages and technologies, perhaps Power Query, and you're definitely going to need to understand how to use DAX and probably SQL, if SQL Server is the back end for this analysis services solution. And then finally, we have the whole app dev story, and as you know, Power BI can be baked into a custom application. So you can embed Power BI using now the premium product, and Power BI can simply be surfaced through a website that you manage, and you can authenticate users, you can surface Power BI visuals, and users out there that you manage can consume that visual experience without really knowing that they're using Power BI perhaps. So this is the great quandary. And I think that Power BI is a tool, and the Power BI ecosystem is a solution that is really intended to span a very broad spectrum of needs. And on one side, we have the traditional enterprise approach to BI. So a single version of the truth. Ralph Kimball said this, and it was published in his Data Warehouse Toolkit a long, long time ago. The idea of having the data warehouse, the data mart, the single semantic layer, that's one version of the truth. And everybody goes there, and we trust that. Requirements might be different across different organizations, different companies, different people think about that a little bit differently, and so there isn't a one-size-fits-all. But generally, the approach of having your data in one place is generally considered a good thing. Data governance might be enforced through a data warehouse, through master data management solution, depending on the discipline of the organization, and maybe bad experience with having lots of copies of data in the past. But that's generally the approach to a governed BI solution. Now we look at the other side. Self-service BI is all the rage and has been for many years. We've seen a lot of competing tools and products that have grown up. And I think one of the reasons that a lot of those tools out there are so popular now is that now we've got savvy computer users. They're not data professionals, they're not developers, they aren't attached to IT, but they understand data well enough that they want to do it themselves. And they've gone to IT and they've said, hey, I would like you to build a project. We'd like you to hear my requirements, and we'd like you to build this thing. And then you wait a year, and then you get something different than you needed. And things change. A lot of us have been down that road. But for that reason, there's an appetite for savvy business users to do a lot of it themselves. Well, there could be some bad news behind that. So a self-service BI solution might be freedom from unnecessary IT process. It could be a proof of concept project that could be strategically migrated to a maintained solution. That might be a good experience. But it could also be an out-of-control side project that works around proper governance controls. And to some degree, a lot of us have probably seen this happen. You know, people talk about spreadsheet sprawl or workbook sprawl, you know, an access sprawl. I mean, you know, you pick your tool. It can be used for good and evil. So how do you avoid this train wreck? And what I'm going to talk about is the best of both worlds. It's the balance between governed data, centrally managed data, secured data, and having the freedom to access and do analytics against that data. So when we think about a Power BI project, a desktop project looks like this. We have the ability to acquire, to transform, to reshape data, to model data, the ability to visualize and analyze that data, all within a convenient desktop tool, and that's published up to the Power BI service, and all within a convenient web portal. But when you think about this in terms of an enterprise solution, it might look like this. So the user's perception is that Power BI is the place to go to be able to analyze my data and get that single version of the truth. But under the water, behind that solution, we may use technologies like SQL Server Analysis Services, SQL Server, or your data platform of choice, Oracle, Teradata, MySQL, Postgres, something that your company has already invested in. You may have an ETL process, a data transformation process, a la SQL Server Integration Services, or DataStage, or Informatica. Again, something that your company is already invested in, people are already skilled in. And a master data management solution where you have data stewards and people who actually manage that data, perhaps outside of IT. All right, so moving along quickly. So what options do you have? Let's just kind of iterate the different models and different approaches where Power BI is either central or Power BI is part of the puzzle. So here we have the Power BI desktop model where I gather data from multiple sources, I shape it, I model it, I publish it to the cloud, and then I have consumers, we share reports. That's kind of the mainstream Power BI story. Well, here we have data on-prem. Now, we've been using the term on-prem pretty liberally, but on-prem might mean data that's in the cloud. It's just governed data that's not necessarily sucked into a Power BI model that lives inside that PBIX file or that data set container. And so I'm going to simplify this, and we'll just categorically say that SQL Server could be Azure SQL Database, and Analysis Services could be Azure Analysis Services. But as far as we're concerned, for discussion purposes, we'll say that that's in your data center, SQL Server or Analysis Services. So you can connect to SQL Server and schedule data refresh that pulls a copy of that data into a cache, into the published Power BI model, and then you can schedule frequent refreshes. Now, in the Pro SKU, you can do that 8 times a day at 30-minute increments. Now with Premium, as we saw this morning, you can do it up to 48 times a day, and I'm not quite sure what the granularity there is, but you have more control. Downside is that you're always refreshing all of the data in all of those cycles. You can't partition it. There are creative and really, really horrible ways that you could break it up into pieces, but generally speaking, it's all of the data that gets refreshed. As opposed to connecting directly to analysis services, whether it's multidimensional, conventional cubes, or tabular, the newer style in memory, where generally speaking, your measures and business rules are managed in that semantic model. But we're going to see that you also have the ability to let users add their own measures on top of that in Power BI Desktop today. Or we can use direct query. I'm going to talk about this, so I don't want to spend a lot of time in it in this slide. Coming very, very soon to a server near you, we will have the ability to publish on-prem, meaning that You don't have to be connected to the internet anymore to be able to deploy a Power BI model, a PBIX file, to a server and share it with users. And that's done through Power BI Report Server, which is really SQL Server Analysis Services in SQL Server 2017 that will host Power BI models. And that is a capability that is in preview now and will ship very soon. And you'll actually be able to manage this all on-prem if you wish. Now, the licensing around that, there's lots of different ways that you can get there. I'll just say it's not cheap. Microsoft wants you using the Enterprise edition of SQL Server with software assurance, and you can get that with premium. James talked about that a little bit today, but that will also be an option. It's not exactly what I'm talking about. I'm just going to summarize this slide really quickly. Just categorically different ways that we can manage on-prem data, or at least enterprise data, and connect through Power BI are to SQL Server on-prem with direct query. I'm going to demonstrate that to you. You need to install the enterprise or the on-prem gateway to do that. I'm going to show that to you. Azure SQL Database, you do not need the gateway because it's in the cloud. So Power BI service is in the cloud. Azure SQL Database is in the cloud. They talk to each other. You don't need to install and configure a gateway. Same is true of Azure-based analysis services. It's in the cloud. Power BI is in the cloud. They can just talk to each other. You just have to give them permission to talk to each other. But with analysis services on-prem, you, again, will install an on-premises gateway. So who's installed and set up the gateway? Have experience with that. So a lot of you, maybe less than half. So I'm going to just quickly show you what that looks like. So let me just kind of tie this up with this is a summary of your options. Scheduled refresh I talked about. Direct query I'm going to show you. Direct connect I'm going to show you. Live streaming is an option. We're not going to have time to get to that. But that's essentially the programmatic option of being able to programmatically send data to a Power BI dashboard that has been published to the service. Okay, so let's take a really quick look at the Power BI gateway. Get my machine to wake up here. So when I go to the Power BI service, the gateway is a very, very simple download. It's right there, the data gateway. There are kind of two flavors of the gateway. There's only one thing to download. When I start this download, it's just simply going to start an installer package, and it'll ask me if I want to set it up for personal use or for enterprise use. And I think that's fairly self-explanatory. If you're a solo analyst and you have access to, let's say, SQL Server, just to create your own model, then you'll probably want to install that on your laptop and use that in personal mode. If you're going to install it on a server where it'll run as a service, the server's going to be on all the time, and that's going to be shared with a number of people, then you'll probably want to install it as in the enterprise mode. So after I've installed the on-premises data gateway, it's a very simple setup. Now, I've already installed it, so I'm not going to be prompted for all of the initial stuff, but it says, it's already been set up successfully. What I would have seen is it would prompt me for the name of my server, it would prompt me for credentials, and then it would ask me to log into my Power BI tenant. That's really all there is to it. Once I've done that, then I can go to my Power BI tenant, and I can manage my gateway. So I go to Manage Gateways, and you can see that I've got a bunch that I don't have connectivity to right now from my demo machines, but here are two that I do have connectivity to. And the name of my laptop is Paul's Yoga 900, so just for demo purposes. So there's a connection that I do have connectivity to right now. So I do have SQL Server Developer Edition 2016 running on my laptop, and I've created this connection with the name of my server. Now, normally I would actually use the real server name rather than localhost, but this will actually work as well. The name of the database, and then I can choose my authentication method. In this case, I can just use regular SQL Server basic authentication and just create a login in SQL Server. But I could also use Windows authentication, which I would normally use. Once that's done, when I deploy a Power BI solution to my tenant, Power BI will look at the gateway and say, hey, I've got a connection over here that matches the same server name in the same database. I'll use that one. And it will use the gateway to connect to my on-premises database. So the other option is to use analysis services. Now, the analysis services through the gateway is pretty easy to explain. It's a little harder to demonstrate because you have to have Active Directory. So I have to have a domain server, and I have to have AD authentication, which I can do here on my machine, but then I also have to have Power BI participating in my Active Directory. So let me just show you a solution. Let me start with Power BI Desktop, and I'm just going to choose Get Data. And I'm going to choose SQL Server Analysis Services Database. Let me just make sure that I've got my Zoom tool running, which I do. So I'll go ahead and select that and connect. I didn't see that highlighted that option, so there's something goofy going on here. Try that again. There we go. All right, so I'm just going to use localhost to normally type the name of my server here. If I were in a production environment, I don't have to enter the database, but this is a key point right here. So I want to connect live rather than importing data. Generally speaking, it's kind of silly to import data from analysis services because its purpose is to provide live connectivity to an optimized set of data. I'm not saying that there may not be a use case for that, but generally speaking, you'd always want to have a live connection to analysis services. So I'm going to do that. And so it'll show me all the databases on my analysis services machine. I'll go ahead and connect to the Wide World Importers database. And because this is a tabular model, the database contains a model named model, which can be renamed, but often we just leave it as is. So you'll notice here that I have the tables just like I would normally have in a Power BI solution, but over on the left side, I do not have my grid view or my diagram view. And that's because the model already exists. There's no opportunity to do data modeling. There's no opportunity to create queries or to manage those tables simply because that's all been taken care of. So in this scenario, an IT developer has already built my cube or my tabular model, and now I'm just connecting to it. All right, but I can go over and let me just expand my sales table, which would be my fact table in this case. And all of my measures have also already been designed. Okay, so because I do have a date dimension table, so I've got my date table right there. And I have a column of dates, as I would normally have in a semantic model. I'm going to look at my measures, and I think, okay, well, that's great. I've got my sale profit. That's a measure that I can use. In fact, let's do a quick visualization. So we'll do, oh, that's awesome. Let's go to date and to month. And then I'll do sale profit against month. That's great that that's not working. Let me do a slicer on my calendar year. Okay, why? Because I'm doing a demo, that's why. Yeah, I don't know why that's the case, but I'm going to quickly open up Power BI Desktop again. Tell you what, I'm going to connect to Contoso just because I had a bad experience with that database. I don't know why, but we'll just do something different just cause. So let's do calendar year, and we'll do a slicer, and then I'll choose the month, and I'll choose a different measure. And let's do, I don't know, account. Let's do strategy plan. This is a set of financial data. Do PC amount there, and then I need to slice that by my strategy plan for that to make sense. Scenario, and a slicer there, and let's do, I'll do my account hierarchy. There we go. Month, put that down there. All right, at least I'm seeing data now. It doesn't matter that. Yeah, so there's some numbers, and then I can change that by year, and I can change my scenario. So I'm connected live, but I want to deploy this up to my service. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to switch back to that earlier set of data, and I would deploy this from Power BI Desktop and just push it up into my service, which is what I've done here. Now this is the worldwide importers database, but this is actually live. This is actually connected, and as I slice, you can see that it's very, very fast. But think about the mechanics of those queries. I've got my analysis services database down here on my server. It doesn't matter where I am. I can be on an airplane connected over GoGo, or I can be in a Starbucks somewhere, and I'm hitting the Power BI service in my tenant, and through the gateway, every time I interact with that report, it's going through the gateway, running a query against analysis services, getting results, and sending them back up. And typically, it's going to be really snappy. Typically, query times can be measured in milliseconds. Okay, so that's against analysis services. Let me jump back. Okay, so we talked about the on-premises gateway. Again, this is the option to either install it in personal mode or in enterprise mode. A major difference is that when you install it in enterprise mode, that it's going to run as a service, and it's expected to be durable. You also have a number of administrative options that you can use. Okay, scheduled refresh we talked about. Again, in Power BI Pro, you can schedule 8 different refresh cycles, and then that's expanded in the premium SKU. By the way, if you're connected to a OneDrive or SharePoint Online, then you can also schedule refresh against that. If you use Excel in OneDrive, you don't even have to schedule refresh. It just happens automatically. And we're seeing more and more of that, where if your data is hosted in the cloud, that Power BI simply works with those services, and you don't necessarily have to schedule a refresh. Okay, so that's Direct Connect. It can work with an on-premises instance. You can use tabular or multidimensional. The requirement for multidimensional is that it needs to be at least SQL Server 2012 SP1 CU4. So that supports DAX queries. Anything after that will work with multidimensional or tabular. And we can connect directly to Azure SSAS without using the gateway. Okay. Generally speaking, I would recommend analysis services as the most flexible option for using Power BI against enterprise data. The caveat, again, is that there's development costs. There's development time. And so we'll talk about direct query and where that can be advantageous and some of the trade-offs in using direct query with analysis services. Okay. I had my model didn't work correctly. I want to go back and, oh, I already have this open. That's why I was flustered with this. So let's say that I need to add a year-to-date calculation. So normally speaking, thank you, normally speaking, and prior to the addition of this feature, if I want to add additional measures as a user, I'd have to go to IT and ask them to add the measure. They'd have to design that in analysis services, go through a whole test cycle, deploy that to the server, and then I would have access to those measures. As of not long ago, we now have the ability to layer additional measures on top of the deployed measures in the analysis services model. And that's what I've done here. So say I'm wanting to add a year-to-date calculation. As a user here in Power BI Desktop, connected to my live analysis services tabular-only model, I can go ahead and add my own measures. Now, there are a handful of measures that will work out of the box. I had a list of the absolutely supported measures, the marginally supported measures, then I had a long list of DAX calculations or DAX functions that weren't supported. However, in circa January or February of this year, they added a preview option and said, well, you know, if you really want to use these DAX functions that may not perform very well and may not be optimized for Direct Connect, you can do that. Just know that you're kind of wading in deep water by doing that. And so if you check this box, there's a whole bunch of DAX functions that become available to you and work. I've yet to find real firm documentation that says these will absolutely work, these might work, and these will never work. I think every month what we're seeing is more and more DAX functions are being added to the either will always work or should work list. And the product team is working very hard to give us a little more flexibility. Oh, and this is in direct query mode, which we're going to talk about here real quick. All right, so now I can add these measures on top of my, my Power BI model. All right, I'm going to go ahead and I've already got this deployed, so I'm not going to publish it just to make sure we don't have any connectivity issues, but I could publish that up to Power BI. I would be prompted to save my changes and then select the workspace. I would choose my enterprise data workspace and then just push that up and wait for it to be published. I'm going to go ahead and go up to that same workspace. So here's my enterprise data workspace. And here is that report that I was just showing you. So this is called Worldwide Importers Direct Query Local 1. I just want to show you that though we're completely live here, I can interact with this model, and it's going to be very, very fast. Okay. Another feature that works really well is I can do forecasts. So essentially all of the visualizations that you could do against a regular PBIX model, you can do with analysis services. Okay. Direct query. This is the feature that, this has been the holy grail for a very long time. Back in the day with multidimensional rollup. This was the feature that was added to analysis services multidimensional to enable real-time analytics over multidimensional. There are always caveats. The mechanism is this. The user experiences that they're connected to a cube or tabular model. They're going to navigate that model. They're going to browse the cube. They're going to interact with the Power BI visuals. And behind the scenes, as those interactions are converted into, back in the day, MDX, Now DAX, the query engine is looking at its data provider and it's saying, oh, you're not really connected to a model. We're going to take that DAX and we're going to translate that through the data provider into the native language of whatever your data source is. So in this case, we're going to convert DAX queries into T-SQL queries on the fly, and it's going to emit T-SQL directly against your data source. Well, as you can imagine, that may work under a variety of scenarios, but if I'm doing year over year, or I'm doing a lot of really heavy periodic and time-based calculations, that's going to create a lot of little subqueries and a lot of potentially some inefficiencies. And so that's why there are a handful of DAX functions that may not perform quite as well. So there are a long list of data providers that are supported, SQL Server always being kind of the first on the list, Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Data Warehouse, but you can see a number of other strong contenders in the industry here, such as SAP HANA, Oracle Teradata, et cetera, more being added all the time. So there are some limitations. They're really architectural limitations, and the things that the product team have been working on for a very long time, but there's just some features of Power BI that just don't work against direct query. So you can only have a single database as a data source, but you can read all of the tables in that database. All of the relationships defined within that database will simply be inherited within your model. So you don't need to actually do any model. Now, this is an old slide. No time intelligence functions. Well, that's no longer true. Time intelligence functions may not perform very well, but a lot of the time intelligence functions are going to work, just with limited support and perhaps with some performance questions. Here's the feature that I pointed out earlier, allow unrestricted measures in direct query mode. In other words, use at your own risk. My experience with direct query has generally been that if I'm just directly connecting to a fact table with some simple dimension tables, I can slice and I can group on those dimension attributes. And as long as I'm doing simple sums or averages, simple aggregations, performance is generally going to be pretty good. Now, if I'm using time intelligence functions or I'm doing more complex calculations, that can slow things down a bit. There are things that you can do to optimize this. This is a great tool to use when your administrator and your developers are all SQL people. And if you don't have those skills to build analysis services models or those resources aren't available, then this is a really good option. I've also found that we can optimize for direct query using features in SQL Server like column store indexes, which is really an implementation of Vertipack. It's the same technology that we're using in analysis services to improve performance. All right, just a feature that I'm going to mention. Query folding is actually a feature of Power Query, of the data mashup technology. But the same concept is going on here. This idea of I'm interacting with a Power BI visual as I'm clicking and dragging and slicing, that the data provider sees that DAX query and it says, oh, this is SQL Server. I know how to translate that to a T-SQL query. And there are some caveats with it. It doesn't always get it right. It's always improving. But it knows how to translate to PL SQL for Oracle. It knows how to talk to Teradata, knows how to talk to these other data providers. But it's actually going to emit queries in those native query languages. So let's go ahead and take a look at direct query. So what I'm going to do, first of all, let's close this guy down. And I'm going to close that. Let's just start with a new Power BI desktop connection. I'm going to do a cooking show demo on you. As I'm waiting for that to open up, I'm actually going to open up a finished version in the background. So there's my direct query local right there. And thank you. Now, remember that I've already indicated that I want to connect to SQL servers. So though the options look similar, you can see that my options are either import or direct query. So I'm going to choose direct query. When I do that, this experience is going to be just a little bit different than it was before. So now I see my SQL Server databases, and I'm going to select individual tables. So again, cooking show demo, so I'll just set this up a little bit. You can see that I have different schemas. So within my fact schema, I have the sale table, and then within my dimension schema, I've got city and date and employee, etc. When I choose to load, I'm not really loading data. In fact, you can see that in this dialog, it says creating model connection. It's not actually importing any data other than just a little bit of preview data. And if I go to edit queries, in the query editor, I do have a preview, but that's really the only data that lives in the model is just a little bit of preview data. And over here under the applied steps, we're not actually seeing transformation steps. It's not changing any data types. It's not parsing anything or promoting headers. It's simply connecting to those tables. All right, now this is the cooking show part of the demonstration where I'm just going to switch to this finished version. And let's say files. Okay, now there aren't going to be any measures in this database, so I have to add calculations now. So I can add calculated columns using DAX formulas. I have to add measures in order for it to be useful, and that's all going to be done in the usual manner in DAX. And you'll see that if I go to the diagram tab, that for all of the tables that I had selected, they're already modeled up. Okay, I really don't have any control over that because these are the relationships that existed in the relational database. All right, so I'm just going to go to the deployed copy of this that is connected through my gateway, and I'm going to open SQL Server Profiler. And I'm already connected to my local server. I'm going to start running a trace, and we'll go back and just interact with that. All right, so just by clicking on Texas, that produced a DAX query. And that sliced this chart over here. So let's go take a look at Profiler and see what it saw. So let's go ahead and pause Profiler, and we'll take a look at the query that it produced. All right, so obviously a T-SQL query. You can see that there's a left join, there's a subquery, and there's the where clause that says where state province equals Texas. Okay, so that's what's happening in the background, is it's taking care of all of that for me, translating my DAX into T-SQL. I'm going to keep going. Let me stop that query. And I want to erase, start it again. Now I'm going to go, so I've added a year to date, and I made a point of using a time intelligence function just so you could see what that does to this query. So we'll just go ahead and choose a different year. So boom, that slice took place. That means that it ran a query. Let's go take a look at SQL Server Profiler and see what it saw. All right, well, let me tell you what it did. I don't actually have a query. That's not the query. That's the reason that we're not actually seeing a query is because it caches my results for a period of time. Since I practiced this, it didn't actually run that query. So I'm going to run that again. And we just choose something that I hadn't chosen before. Let's see if that's new. Yeah. Still cached my results. See, Power BI is just so smart. Yeah, darn it. Yeah, I practiced this all up ahead of time, and I believe that it's already cached all of my results.
Is it Power BI that's caching?
Yeah, it's the Power BI service that's caching the data. And I forget what the cache period is, but it's smart enough to say, well, that data, the row counts haven't changed, and it looks like the data hasn't changed. There's no reason to rerun the queries if it's already holding it in cache on the service. There it is. Okay, this is awesome. This is what I wanted to show you. All right, so that's what, oh, darn it. Oh, that's what year-to-date does. That's what the dates YTD function does. So this will just give you a glimpse in how hard Power BI has to work when you use these time intelligence functions, because it's having to take some, not super complex logic, but there's some intricacies in here to translate that into T-SQL. So the bottom line, the takeaway from this should be, if you elect to use direct query, if you have to use direct query, don't have the option to use analysis services, then be aware that there's a lot of complexity, and potentially there could be some performance costs when doing anything other than very simple aggregations. All right. And finally, I'll just wrap up by mentioning content packs are a very simple feature of Power BI that essentially let you take deployed content, a la data sets, reports, the report pages, and the dashboards that are created from the visuals on those reports, that allow you to kind of create this package that you give a name, you can share specifically with groups of users in a workspace, and then they can use that either as a starting point or just as a kind of a named package of data to consume. It's a very simple concept. The product team have just recently announced that they're transitioning content packs to what they call Power BI apps. Conceptually, it's the same thing. The implementation within the service is a little bit different. But it very simply is a way of saying, I'm going to create this workspace. I'm going to deploy stuff to it. It could be a number of PBIX files, all with their own data sets, connections to the gateway, et cetera. And then you're just going to take that collection of stuff within that workspace and brand it as an app so that users can then just be pointed to this thing that they, quote unquote, install within the subscription. And then they can consume that to make it a very simple, streamlined user experience. All right. So some resources, since you can download this deck, this is a number of places you can go to get a little more information just about enterprise scale solutions in general. And remember that these will be available on June 27th, all the recordings. So this will all be downloadable from the website. And there is a related session. Dima and Robert are doing a session. I don't have the timing for this. Going deep on setting up the on-premises data gateway. And with that, we actually have, that's it. I just ran out of time. 1 minute remaining. So if you have questions, I'll be around. You're welcome to come up. With that, I'll thank you for your time. Appreciate you coming and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.